Well, Pete Seeger died last Monday in a New York hospital. And in the past week, many people have expressed their deep personal feelings about his life and his work, but most of them talked about who he was as a person. And since he lived here in New England for most of his 94 years and was always involved in community events, a lot of people have stories to tell. And I was lucky enough to meet him last year. I spent an afternoon at his house overlooking the Hudson River with Jim Scott and recorded 2 benefit concerts they performed at Unitarian Universalist churches. UUs don't have saints, but if we did, there'd be a lot of us calling for Jim's immediate, or for Pete's immediate beatification. Pete wouldn't have any of that, of course. He was always deflecting the spotlight from himself, and he saw his fame as much of a burden as an opportunity. He told Evelyn McDougall, the director of the Amandla Chorus, that he envied her ability to do her work out of the glare of the world's spotlight. He wasn't a saint, but he certainly was a mensch. A mensch, if you don't know, it's Yiddish for a person of integrity and honor. And even people who disagree with him politically would agree that he was a person of integrity and honor. We all benefit from considering the lives of the mensches and any life well lived. So now let us consider the life of Pete Seeger. Pete was, and it's hard to talk about him in the past tense, Pete was a musician and a social activist. And for us this morning, it's natural for us to assume that those roles ought to be intertwined. After all, our hymn book is filled with that combination. And what we forget is that before the 60s, before Pete Seeger helped folk music find a wider audience, most popular music avoided about social issues. Now, last Sunday, I watched the Grammy Awards, which is a smorgasbord of all kinds of music. And some music is there to entertain us, to release energy, to be a diversion, and that is perfectly okay. It can be a lot of fun to see the spectacle of Beyonce or Pink or Katy Perry performing with all the staging and lighting and pyrotechnics and literally fireworks and backup dancers in costumes. But as a child of the 60s, a musician myself, I remember that brief period when music was more important than the music business. And I can't help but reflect on the difference between a musician who sings her song while doing circus tricks on a trapeze suspended above the audience, and that skinny old man in blue jeans going out on stage with just his banjo and his guitar. Now, I love a good show, and my career has been focused on music technology, and I like lighting, and I'm a lighting technician. But I was struck by how often at the Grammys, all this fabulous technique in sound, light, and video was in the end pretty meaningless and empty. We get caught up in the star-making machinery, in the big gaudy show, what Pete himself called that Tin Pan Alley stuff. To compensate, I think, in some cases for lyrics that don't express anything particularly important, and music that sounds like it was produced on a factory floor instead of by human beings. And Jim Scott tells a story about a fan who came up to him after a show and said, "Wow, all of your songs are about something," which points out that many, if not most of the songs we hear on the radio, most things in our culture are not really about anything. Now, in defense of the Grammys, I used to be a NARIS member myself. One of the big production numbers that they had was a celebration of love in all its forms to the Macklemore and Ryan Lewis song, Same Love. That's a song that's as honest and progressive as anything Pete wrote and advocated extending marriage rights to gay people. But it's a rap song, so many of us may not have heard it. And you can look it up on YouTube. It was a very inspiring 7 minutes in the Grammy Awards, in the midst of a lot of showy stuff. Now, in a sense, these different kinds of popular music reflect the traditional divisions of music into its sacred and secular forms. One is sung in the bars and pubs, and the other one is sung in churches. And now, Pete Seeger was raised and belonged to a Unitarian church, but when you asked him about his religion, he'd say something like, "Well, I kind of follow all religions that seek the truth. And I think folk music has that ethic at its core of not preaching a particular dogma, but following the spirit of the truth that springs up spontaneously from the people and our experience. That's why it's called folk music. Now, at my college, I hung out at this coffee house called Amazing Grace, run by a co-ed collective of students who offered vegetarian lunches every day and a music coffee house every weekend. And those evenings of music, even though they weren't, of course, religious, they often felt sacred. There was something going on that was more than just a performance. And most of the performers of that time were singer-songwriters with just a guitar and a vocal, maybe piano. And the coffee house was too small to handle a rock band. And what I saw in that folk singer-songwriter experience was this back and forth between the performer and the audience. Not just in the songs, but what they said in between the songs. The stars of the folk circuit at that time weren't slick, they didn't have props, they didn't need big sound equipment, just a guitar and a mic. What mattered in that environment was your sincerity, your depth, and your insight. Even musical skill was secondary up to a point. And we in the audience became more like a congregation there to be uplifted and informed. Pete was a master in that kind of environment. His song introductions are as worth listening to as his songs themselves. And he was happiest when the crowd sang along. He didn't want his music to call attention to him, but to facilitate community. And in that sense, he was the best kind of religious musician. Now, we all know that he advocated for a lot of causes through his life. He began his career singing with Woody Guthrie, singing at union rallies. He continued his parents' pacifism by protesting against war. With the Almanac Singers, they actually sang a controversial song against getting involved in World War II before World War II broke out. In the 60s, he stood, and actually in the 50s, he stood with Martin Luther King, fighting for civil rights at a time when you could easily lose your life doing that. And later on in his life, he couldn't stand what industrial pollution had done to the Hudson River, so he enlisted friends to sail up the river on the sloop Clearwater, protesting water pollution. After long, persistent work, the Hudson is no longer an open sewer, and there's a movement afoot, which I hope succeeds, to name the new Tappan Zee Bridge the Pete Seeger Bridge. In the 1980s, he went on tour with younger musicians to advocate for the end of nuclear power and turning our economy towards green energy. He never gave up, even after about 1980, 70, he said his singing voice was shot and his hands weren't as fast as they once were. Pete Seeger believed that songs had the power to change things, but he wasn't some kind of zealot. He was a very Unitarian person in his skepticism about the powerful, and he acted with conviction, trying to move the needle of our culture towards the positive side. He was always humble and willing to examine his own ideas. He was an American in his belief in freedom and free expression, but he paid dearly for it. He went from having a #1 record on the charts for almost 3 months in 1950 to, in 1955, being threatened with a 10-year prison sentence for contempt of Congress, for refusing to testify about his membership in the Young Communist League when he was at Harvard. Most people who were persecuted during that McCarthy era, the witch hunt of the 50s, got off the legal hook by asserting Fifth Amendment. I refuse to answer that question on the grounds it might tend to incriminate me. Well, Pete didn't think he'd done anything criminal, so he made a point of refusing to answer these right-wing representatives' questions on the basis of the First Amendment, freedom of association. I'm not going to answer any questions about my political or religious beliefs, associations, or meetings, who my friends are, or anything like that, because you have no right to ask me those questions. And after all, what is criminal about advocating one economic system over another anyway? Nonetheless, in the 1950s, they cut him off from the mass market. By the 1960s, his contempt of Congress and his pacifist beliefs were shared by a new generation because of the war in Vietnam. And Seeger became the spiritual uncle of Bob Dylan, Judy Collins, Joan Baez, Joni Mitchell, the Byrds, Crosby, Stills and Nash, and Jackson Browne. A whole generation of singer-songwriters who had the idea that all your songs could be about something. Now, Pete didn't see himself as some kind of pioneer or father of folk music, but he was its conscience. He was always willing to speak his mind. Now, after this folk resurgence in the 60s and things became commercial, Pete could have gone along for the ride. He'd been out there on the blacklist for 17 or so years. But when the Smothers Brothers booked him for the first time on national television, what song does he sing? Waist Deep in the Big Muddy, a protest song against Vietnam that made Lyndon Johnson seem to be a fool. The big fool wants to push on, and CBS censored it. After 17 years, boy, didn't he learn his lesson. That's the kind of independence and dedication to expressing your beliefs, no matter the cost to yourself, that is the stuff we think of as saintly. Seeger was a model not only for his songwriting, but his moral presence. He was an example of how to behave as an artist in the political world. You can see that in John Lennon's willingness to risk his career at the service of what he believed in, a willingness to speak and sing frankly about things, even if his ideas would be violently opposed by a segment of the audience. Now, that period in the 60s when our generation revolted against the materialism of the music business and this idea of records as a tool to encourage social change, it moved out of Pete's folk genre and it got into rock and pop. The idea was that musicians had not only the right to speak about social issues, but the responsibility to do so. Now, this kind of activism has its dangers. And on NPR, Terry Gross interview you can hear online, he told a chilling story of having sung at a I think it was a rally for a socialist candidate for president in upstate New York with Paul Robeson. And the local police had joined the Ku Klux Klan and were lined up. The police were standing on the side, and the Ku Klux Klan were stoning with rocks every car that left that thing, and the police had channeled them down this one road that the Klan had staked out. Well, excuse me. Well, last February, when Pete and Jim Scott did these concerts in Rock Tavern in White Plains, we went to his house overlooking the Hudson, and I brought my video camera, and I still have to put a lot of that footage online. His daughter had to pick us up at the foot of his driveway because it's one of these rural country do-it-yourself driveways with muddy stuff and the water's coming down as the thaw happens. And unless you had four-wheel drive, you couldn't make it up his driveway. When we got up to the top, you could just feel this man's integrity, his kindness, his centeredness, his intelligence, authenticity, and a sense of deep contentment, which you don't find in a lot of radical political people. I don't feel them are contented. They're always agitated. Pete was not agitated. He would agitate, but he was not agitated himself. He had built this home, he had designed the wood stove that heated it, and at the age of 94, I have footage of him going out with Jim to the electric pickup truck and throwing logs in the back of his truck to heat the house. Someone said on WAMC this week that Pete Seeger is on a continuum between John Lennon and Gandhi, and that certainly felt true. But he was also very down to earth. You know, I'm in the living room of this guy who's had an entire 2-hour-long American Masters program on PBS and come up his muddy driveway and drinking tea in his living room. He was taking care of his wife, Toshi, who passed away really about 6 months ago, I think. Toshi couldn't walk anymore. She'd had a stroke. She wasn't always lucid. But she would still come out with a wisecrack now and then. In between breaks in their rehearsal, Pete had great stories to tell. And I saw he was still a dedicated musician working on his craft with those 94-year-old hands, along with this younger composer and guitarist he admired. And his house had a wonderful vibe to it. It's this two-room place on kind of an angle with great views out over. It's on a bluff way over the Hudson. And he has the first house he built is a guest cottage that his daughter was living in, and there's a big barn that the hippies decorated in the 60s, and it's been left that way. His living room has this loft up above it that's just filled with his bookshelves. He subscribed to about 40 different magazines. And it has something of the atmosphere of Greenfields Market. Now, he bought this land in the 1940s because he knew as a roving musician you have to have a place to come home to. He believed that to do good music, if you don't want to sell out to commercial interests, musicians need to live simply, well within their means. Then they can't control you. Pete told an old Arab proverb, when the king puts a poet on the payroll, he cuts out the tongue of the poet. Pete Seeger was never on anybody's payroll, and he sang out until the end of his life. He admired any songs that help us understand where we are and what we've got to do. And what a difference from the life of a superstar. Now, he had a comfortable life, but he chose to make it Spartan. He didn't believe in hoarding money. He gave a lot of it away. Even though his songs, Where Have All the Flowers Gone, Turn, 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 and If I Had a Hammer are valuable copyrights, he said he didn't believe that copyrights should extend past the life of the artist. He believed songs came through him and in that sense belonged to the world. Now, he had drifted away from the Communist Party in the 1940s. He said later, boy, if the communists had taken over, he would have been the first one they put in jail. But his conviction that our economic system is fundamentally immoral when it's at its worst, that belief persisted. Now, before I was born, this man, a New England Unitarian by habit and birth, had been declared an enemy of the state by the House Un-American Activities Committee. And he saw his music career go from Carnegie Hall to parish halls. And they were right. He was an enemy of any state, left wing or right wing, that oppresses people, that favors wealth over justice, that lets companies dump chemicals into rivers, that kills people of other races and spends more on weapons than it spends on schools. Now, there was an inscription on Pete's banjo head that said, "This machine surrounds hate and forces it to surrender." Not defeats hate, not kills fascists, as Woody Guthrie's guitar was inscribed, but surrounds. Pete's belief was that, gunmen and bombers don't change the world. He believed that an inspired mass of people, a vast majority of people, have the ability to overwhelm hate on all sides and make it give up without firing a shot. That was the message of the civil rights movement. That was the message of the song, "We Shall Overcome," that Pete brought into prominence in those days. When it comes to economic justice, the 1%, who actually a smaller number, I think it's something like 1/10%, who have more wealth than half the planet, are by definition a small minority. Seeger had seen the power that the 1% has. They could make his records disappear from the stores and make concert halls refuse to book him, even though he'd had the #1 record in the country. That minority can be surrounded once the people are awakened. And Pete set out to awaken people with his actions and with his music. During the McCarthy hearings, during civil rights marches, during anti-Vietnam protests, during anti-nuclear protests, Pete would be there, a man of unquestioned integrity, dedication to the cause, and this is really crucial, a man of goodwill. He was enraged by what he saw, but he didn't come off as angry. He didn't fall into despair. There was always something positive about him, something clean, simple, and enlightened. Even as a 94-year-old man, people came to him looking for encouragement, for him to tell us that things can change for the better. Now, with the wisdom of his age and experience, he said he was more optimistic about the faith of humanity, which he still only put at about 50-50 for us to survive. He was more optimistic, he said, than he was 50 years ago when the atom bomb first was dropped. He thought technology might just save us if it doesn't kill us first. if it gives so many millions of paths of independent, free information, that women and children might together convince men that the pursuit of power and money is pointless. On Democracy Now!, this is also online, on YouTube, he told a parable that's good for us to remember in these times whenever we feel that trying to change the world is pointless. I honestly believe, he said, that the future is going to be a million little things saving us. Imagine a big seesaw, and at one end, this seesaw is on the ground with a big basket of rocks on it. The other end of the seesaw is up in the air, and it has a basket 1/4 full of sand. And some of us have teaspoons, and we're trying to fill it with sand. A lot of people are laughing at us. They say, "Oh, people like you have been trying to do this for thousands of years. It's leaking out as fast as you can put it in." But we're saying, we're getting more people with teaspoons all the time. And we think one of these years, we're going to see that whole seesaw go whoop in the other direction. And people will say, "Gee, how did it happen so suddenly?" Us and all our little teaspoons. Now, granted that, we'll have to keep putting it in, because if we don't, it will leak out and the rocks will take over again. But look at the optimism of that last verse of "I had a hammer" that we sang. "Now I've got a hammer," goes the last verse. He believed that we did have the power. We have the hammer of justice. We have the bell of freedom. And thanks to him, we have songs about love between all the people all over the world. He embodied that love all through his life, and the world is better for it. Our closing song is less familiar to you. I heard him do this for the first time when he sang it at these concerts with Jim in New York. It was written by him and a local songwriter, Lori Wyatt, who lives in Greenfield. And I think this song will make its way into some future UU hymnal because it encapsulates our theology about social justice. Now, some denominations think the world is so messed up that it's not worth saving, and Christians should focus their efforts on the next world, not this one. Unitarian Universalists don't believe we have to wait for some apocalyptic return of Jesus for the world to get better. God isn't going to make the kingdom come magically. We are the instrument to make the kingdom come. And that's what this song, "God's Counting on You," says. All of us can make a difference. None of us is too small or powerless to affect the world. Our little teaspoons of sand may be too small to outweigh the rocks of oppression by themselves, but millions of teaspoons together over time is what tips the balance towards justice. We can surround hate and force it to surrender through the force of our music, our community, and the strength of our ideas. Let us go out now into the world in peace, hoping we'll all pull through.